Well, spiritual growth is a process. It's not an event. It's the process of our lifetime. And the evidence for that is overwhelming in our world around us. Just think of our growth as a human being from conception to birth, all that change that goes on in that period of time, all the growth that goes on. It's slow, but it's amazing. And then we're born, and we have that whole development from being a child or an infant to a child, to a teenager, to an adult, and to old age. So that's a nice image of that. And then we think about plants, vegetation, animals, trees, all living things really, and the seasons that we endure in life as well, in time. It takes time. However, there's lots of contrasting data to that. It makes us impatient, and we makes us believe that things can be instant in our lives when they really aren't. So we're trained to be impatient, and it works against that idea that life is a process and that it's slow. If you want to buy something, you can go on Amazon and order it and have it the next day, right? So you don't have to wait. Well, I want that. It shows up. You can pay more and have it right away. Maybe you get regular shipping because you're a patient person and you wait 3 days. If you want to watch a movie, you just log on and watch it. You don't have to figure out movie times usually. You don't have to wait, oh, it's not out yet. You just go online and watch it. You want to watch a TV show? Go online and watch it. You can even binge the whole season in one setting if you want to. Some people wait a whole year so they can just binge it all when it comes out instead of having to wait. My kids don't understand that. We're watching a show that's actually current. And like, can we watch the next one? Well, we have to wait a week for it to come out. Like, what? So we have this idea that we can have everything we want instantly. But if you think about it, everything that's really of value, like relationships and job satisfaction and spiritual growth or deep happiness, takes time. It takes time to sort it out. It takes time for things within us to change and grow. And thankfully, sort of as an aside, there's the slow movement of slow cooking for food, and we're slowing down a pace of life and maybe encouraging people to garden so they observe that things do take time and that it takes work and that it slowly comes and that you aren't the one that grows it. You might cultivate it and plant it, but it grows without your effort. That's the Lord's doing. So we've been talking about this subject of love over ego in the story of Daniel and talking about how it's a process that we go through. And we saw that illustrated in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, who began very self-centered and very angry and vengeful if he didn't get what he wanted, toward the end of chapter 4, where he's praising the Lord and recognizing that it's not about him. It's about God, and everything that he has is from God. The kingdom is beautiful, but it's not of his own doing. It's something the Lord did for him. And that reading that was shared talks about how the Lord won't drive out the enemies of the land from the children of Israel in one day or instantly, but little by little I will drive them out from before you until you can occupy the land. And that's talking about our spiritual life. It's that the Lord takes time to change us so that we can enter into that life successfully. Talked about if I did it right away, that the animals and the vegetation would just overtake it. It would be sort of become desolate. So we need time. It's part of how it works. It's a neat story about Elijah too, where he was fighting against the prophets of Baal, the false god, and he had them destroyed essentially, and he ran off into the wilderness, and he's hiding in a cave and wondering, where all his help is. And a voice comes to him and asks him to come out of the cave, and there's a fire, and there's an earthquake, and a mighty wind. And after each one of those, it says the Lord was not in those things, but after those, there was a still small voice. And that still small voice told him all of the answers to the things he was concerned about. But think about that stillness, that quietness. The Lord doesn't come in those violent, dramatic ways with fire and earthquake and wind, but in stillness. So we're going back to chapter 1 of Daniel. The story began with Nebuchadnezzar taking Jerusalem and bringing captives to Israel. Remember Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. I remember them. Those people who were later named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken and trained to serve the king. But part of what he took there was the vessels that were in the temple, special sacred vessels. He took them from them, brought them to his kingdom. And we noticed with him initially, he was violent, he had an angry temper, and he was very interested in himself. And we saw him change slowly over time, shifts in his attitude, shifts in his behavior. And now he's actually passed on, he's died, which means that there's a transition. There's a new king, and there's a new thing that we need to reconcile within ourselves. But notice they're still in Babylon. They're still captive in Babylon. We're still talking about selfishness, which is what Babylon represents here, self-love. And they're ruled by a king, pictures our ego or opprobrium. But it's different now. And our journey of life, we begin by learning from the Word what is true. We learn from the Word, and it begins to impact our thinking initially. So at first we start to think, well, okay, I might want to change my behavior. And then it starts to slowly change maybe how we feel about things, how we want to behave. But one of the things that's really hard to bring under control is our behavior, right? The external acts of selfishness sometimes are the hardest ones to break. So Nebuchadnezzar took the vessels from the temple. Jerusalem pictures the church within us, that spiritual place. And the vessels picture the truths from the Word that make the church possible. They teach us who God is and how to live our lives and how to love one another and how to worship. And even our ego knows that those are important things to learn, but initially when we're in a state of selfishness, we learn them not for the sake of change, but because we want to maybe appear smart, or we want to be in the know. We want people to know that maybe we're religious. We go to church so that maybe we'll be trusted in business, that kind of thing. But it's really not about changing who we are. So the vessels were taken from Jerusalem. They were taken, but they weren't being used to worship the Lord. Think about what is worship anyway. Is this worship that we're having right now? This is a form of worship. This is the external manifestation of worship. But true worship is how we are on the inside. Are we a loving person? Are we a charitable person? I love this passage from the Heavenly Doctrines that say a person who is in love and charity is worshiping all the time. So it's not something that we schedule for Sunday morning at 10:30 that true worship happens, but we do it because this is a representation or a manifestation of what we're hoping is going on the inside of ourselves, is we're humbling ourselves and we're trying to serve one another and learn and change. That's important. But the true worship is how we live our life. So Daniel in these stories pictures the voice of the truth in our heads, what is called our conscience. So that's why we read about conscience today. And notice through these chapters of Daniel, Daniel becomes more prominent. He becomes more respected. He becomes a greater force for good. And that pictures how our own conscience is built over time. It is kind of quiet at first, and it starts to build and starts to strengthen, and it starts to have a stronger place in our life. And it's first kind of intellectual, it knows truth, and then it becomes more about how we're feeling, but then we actually really have to change our external behavior. Maybe you've had this feeling yourself as, I know what I want to do, I really want to do it, but I'm having a hard time actually doing it. Is that true? I mean, seems true to me. Like, it's easy to think about the truth, right? It's easy to imagine the kind of person we want to become, and we may even be excited about it on the inside, like, yeah, that would be wonderful. And we keep misstepping, we keep not doing it, because it takes time to do that. So finally, it begins to impact our behavior, and those bad habits are hard to break. One of the hard things about breaking an external habit is that it has delight attached to it, right? If you've done something, everything has delight attached to it, whether it's evil or good. They have delight attached to it. So you'd think, well, why? I wouldn't want to do anything evil or bad because it's evil and bad. But it does have delight attached to it. So you do it and you go, oh, that was really nice, even though it might hurt or you see that it's hurting somebody else. And so we have the memory of that. We have that hook in us, so to speak, and it tugs at us. If you ever tried to give up certain foods, for example, let's say you're trying to give up sugar, and if you try to do that, it gets a little bit easier the more distance you have from it, doesn't it? Like, oh, I haven't had it for a week, so it's getting a little less less of a hook in me. And as more time passes, it's not even a thought anymore. But if you go back and have a little bit, like, oh, I'll just have that little piece of chocolate and taste that, and suddenly you have a taste for it again. Oh, man. And it's really hard to let go of it again. It's pretty similar to what we're dealing with spiritually. Well, Belshazzar, this new king, his name means Baal, protect the king. So it really means false god, protect me, is what it's saying. So it's kind of about self again. A new king, and this talks about a new side of our ego that needs to be corrected. So when we're introduced to Belshazzar, he's drinking and partying and feasting, and he's trying to impress all the lords of the land. There's nothing wrong with drinking a bit and eating and going to a party or being on social media for a little while. But it's too much. When it becomes too much, then it becomes a problem, right? It's the imbalance. It's when we're numbered and weighed and found wanting. Well, Belshazzar's having this feast, and he says, maybe he's getting drunk and he's sort of losing his inhibitions. He's like, hey, go get the vessels from the temple that we took and bring them out here, and let's fill them up and let's drink out of those instead. You kind of can smell the profanation a mile away, like, that just doesn't seem right. It doesn't. These vessels are dedicated to serving the Lord, and you're going to take them and have them at a party and drink out of them and celebrate. You and your concubines and all your drunken friends are going to drink out of them. And profanation is twisting something around, using something sacred for a bad use, or a selfish use perhaps. Like you can see things that are beautiful used in destructive ways, like sex or drugs that can heal but are used in abusive ways, or alcohol or leisure or media. They use them to numb and divert us from actually dealing with things that we need. So this picture is us, him going to getting these things and drinking out of them, pictures us going to the Word, because those vessels picture those truths from the Word. But we go to it in a selfish state where we're only thinking about ourselves and not trying to correct our behavior. Maybe we're looking at to support our own selfish behavior instead of trying to correct our behavior. You ever do that? Turn to the Word to try to figure out, is my behavior acceptable? Is this okay? Like, where's the fine print that says behaving like this is actually all right? Where's the loophole? Where's the escape clause, or the fine print that says it's really not that bad? So that's what it pictures. If we're using the truth, but not for the right reasons. We're using it to kind of justify ourselves rather than to change who we are. And you can see it, the allegiance of Belshazzar and his companions shining through, because they start, when they're drinking out of these vessels, they, instead of worshiping the Lord, they start to worship their false gods of gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone. And you think, well, I don't do that. I don't use truth to bow down to idols. What are you talking about? Do we really worship idols these days? I mean, that's old stuff. We don't do that anymore, right? Well, really, it's about any time that we make anything more important than the Lord and the Lord's plan, that we don't listen to the truth. We're essentially doing the same thing. Now, let's talk about what those picture in the story, because each one of these types of false gods, we can think about them in a certain way. Like gold, the god of gold pictures that false understanding of divine things. So we can think of God as judgmental and hateful, and so I can be too. Because look what it says in the Word. It says God wiped these people out. We even saw that today in the story. Wipe out the enemies, destroy them all. He's talking about getting rid of our own selfishness. He's not talking about going and hurting somebody else. But we use that to justify my hateful view of some other group of people, perhaps, instead. Or the gold of silver is a false concept of spiritual things. Like, there's no eternity, there's no life after death, so it really doesn't matter how I live my life. Or that god of brass, falsifying or falsities around charity. And we think that charity is about, well, it's about, you make about doing what's good so that I look good, instead of, well, real charity is shunning evils in my life and turning away from those things and doing what's good because it's the right thing to do. The gods of stone picture falsities about faith in the Lord. Well, if I'm saved by faith alone, if I declare that I believe Jesus died for my sins and I'm saved, I can live the kind of life. It doesn't really matter because I'm cleared. I'm good to go. So we might think that that's okay, and we worship that God. And finally, worshiping a false god of wood, falsities about good works. This idea that if I do enough good things, like, we talk about if I'm living a pretty destructive life over there, well, if I just do a whole bunch of good things, that'll kind of solve the problem. I'll just sort of wipe it out by my good. Well, we actually have to change these behaviors, because otherwise these behaviors are all about me instead about service to somebody else. So it's all about us clothed in truth. Truth used to justify our behavior. So they're drunk at this party, and I think that pictures abusive indulgence in our own false thinking. And maybe we do that too, is that we know what we're doing is wrong. We know that what we want to do is wrong. And we drink in as many justifications as we can, and we act irrationally about it. Say things like this: I should have known better. You ever say that? I should have known better. Well, I did know better. I just didn't choose to behave differently. I did know. Yeah, I should have known better is kind of a cop-out. Yeah, we knew better. But we do have a conscience that the Lord is building in us. Daniel is there. And this is a beautiful thing about this conscience, is that it shows up. It starts to get a little bit disturbed and uncomfortable, and it bugs us. And it torments us a little bit. The writings use the word the pangs of conscience, where we actually have pain around the idea of doing the wrong thing. It actually causes us pain. Because we know there's going to be a judgment. We know there's the writing on the wall, and we see it, and it scares us a little bit. Like, Because when we do realize we're messing up, it is frightening. So in the story, this supernatural thing happens. This disembodied hand starts to write on the wall in the middle of this party. I hope that wasn't too terrifying for you, but, there's no blood or anything. It's just a hand. But you see the writing on the wall, and this party is happening, and this hand shows up. Because when we realize that our life is not aligned with the Word, when we see what the Word is saying, it kind of is disturbing to us, just like Belshazzar is uncomfortable. So I want to back up for a second and think about our ego. We've been talking about that pictured by Nebuchadnezzar, and that we see over the last 4 chapters that his kind of breaking down, like his dominion around his own sense of greatness and power is starting to break down, where he's become softer. He starts to go, this God of Daniel's is pretty cool, so don't say anything bad about him. That's kind of his, initially. And then, actually, I praise the Lord and worship the Lord. He is the source of things. So it starts to change. And Nebuchadnezzar would have initially threatened somebody, like, he had this thing happen, and he's like, bring all the soothsayers and Chaldeans and have them tell me what it means. And if they can tell me what it means, I'll give them a purple robe and a gold around their neck, and they'll become third in the kingdom. So he's using, like, rewards, whereas Nebuchadnezzar would have said, and if they can't, then I'll cut them in pieces and burn their house to the ground. So kind of a different approach. So it's softening. There's still something there, but it's softening. So Daniel is called in, not because Belshazzar remembers that Daniel is there, but because the queen says, well, here's a man in the kingdom. Maybe you don't remember this, that there's a man in the kingdom that can do this. He's helped your father a lot, and so he's called in. Our conscience is brought in. And notice that Daniel's not called Belteshazzar anymore. They call him actually Daniel. Daniel, come in. Daniel means God is my judge. This recognition that, we do need the Lord in our life as he's here. But we're still in Babylon, but the ego is weakening. And the more we can be governed by our conscience, the more it can do the right thing, our ego starts to lose its grip on us. And it's the work of our lifetime. It's a process. And Daniel tells Belshazzar that, you didn't learn a whole lot from your dad. You didn't take the lessons of before and change them. And I think this is about how we take the lessons from the Lord's Word, and we know what we're supposed to do. We think about it, that would be the right thing to do, but we haven't really changed our behavior. I'll call it spiritual procrastination, where, we mull it over, we think it's a good idea, but we really don't do it. And so the meaning of these words kind of tells what the next step is. Mene, mene, tekel parsin, which is about repentance. Mene, mene means we need to number our states, assess the quality of our actions. Number signifies the quality, like what's the quality of my life? And it says it twice to kind of say, get serious about this. Take assessment of yourself. Do it repeatedly, do it thoroughly throughout your lifetime. Examine yourself. Recognize what your faults are. Pray to the Lord for help and begin a new life is what those steps are. And then tekel means that you were weighed in the balance and found wanting. So we look at our balance of our life and go, it's off. Something's not right here. So we may not be measuring up to the way we want to be living. And we have those pains of conscience. And a parson means divided. That means we need to divide it, separate that from ourselves. We need to remove those attitudes and live a new life. Now, after Daniel told him this, even though Daniel said, don't give me those gifts, keep them for yourself, he gives them to Daniel because our conscience is raised to a higher position. Our conscience takes on a more dominant role the more we are able to listen to our conscience and be changed by it. As Jiminy Cricket said, let your conscience be your guide. Let it be that thing, because your conscience really is the presence of the Lord within you, speaking to you. It's Him there telling us the right thing to do. And when we shut it out, we're shutting out the Lord's presence. So Belshazzar doesn't last long. He dies that very night. That's it. Chapter 5, he's in and he's out. Next time we'll have a new king, King Darius, which is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Because even when we start to change our behavior, there is a lot of temptation that comes along with it. There's struggle that follows. So this death of Belshazzar, which we often think of as a bad thing, can picture a transition. We're shifting into a new state where the old state is ending and a new one is beginning. So I invite you to examine yourself. See if there is any writing on the wall, so to speak, saying, all right, we know what we're supposed to do. The writing's on the wall. Am I willing to actually change my behavior? Am I actually willing to live differently? So I'm not numbered and measured and found wanting. And that is the hard step. It's hard to let go of those things, but we've got to practice them and do them.